Welcome to SDG 101, brought to you from RDC Studio in Kuala Lumpur. Here you are with me again, Muhammad, a public policy consultant. Thank you for tuning in to our channel today. We will continue our discussion with the looking at behavioral insights and how it can be implemented in achieving SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. In particular, the two goals, which is goal number 1, no poverty, in goal number 10 in the SDG, which is to do with reducing inequality, income and wealth inequality within and among countries. First, let's look at poverty in ASEAN. Even though we are already in year 2020, poverty is still an issue in many countries. From this chart, for example, in ASEAN, the poverty rate is as high as above 30% in a country like Myanmar. And some countries like Philippines, they are over 20%. So poverty is very much a part, an issue in this part of the world, in ASEAN, even though obviously some countries have lower poverty rate than the other. So it's a real issue. What I'm going to share today about the application of behavioral insights in addressing poverty is a real issue that is facing our society and a challenge that is faced our government today. In a recent report produced by ESCAP, ESCAP, which is a UN agency based in Bangkok on inequality in Asia Pacific, it is reported that inequality in this region is on the rise. Inequality rose for the poorest 85% of the population between early 90s and early 2010. And if you look at income inequality, which is normally measured using Gini coefficient, we know that we still have a lot of room to improve in terms of reducing the gap between the rich and the poor, be it in Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and many other countries in this region. Before we go into discussing on how behavioral insights can have an impact or can benefit initiatives to address poverty and income inequality, let's look at the UNDP Human Development Concept, or HDI, Human Development Index, in which we look at poverty and to a certain extent income inequality from 3 key dimensions. One is about having a decent standard of living so that people can live in an acceptable living standard. Secondly, is about ability to gain or acquire knowledge in education for the children, so that there's social mobility. People who are in poverty, for example, can move out of the poverty trap. And the third dimension in UNDP Human Development Index is about so that people, the population, have a long and healthy life. And some of the criteria that is looked at, for example, is in terms of life expectancy, and this is very much relevant to the healthcare access to the people. Looking and measuring poverty is through the lens of multi-dimensional poverty, which is measured using MPI, or multi-dimensional poverty index. There are 3 key dimensions in MPI. One is to do with living standard, second is to do with education, and third is about health or access to healthcare. And through multidimensional poverty, we look at deprivation that people face, especially if they are in poverty. and looking at also the intensity of deprivation among individuals or among households within society. With that, I think quick introduction about the concepts of poverty and income inequality, and some data on what's happening in this region, particularly Asia Pacific, on the two issues of poverty and income inequality. So what does behavioral insights or behavioral science can offer to address these two issues? And this is where I think the key message here, behavioral insights bring a new perspective to poverty and income inequality. It provides a more comprehensive look at how do we go about handling or addressing these two issues that we try to address through the SDGs, the two SDG goals. Traditionally, economists and policymakers look at addressing poverty and income inequality through economic resource in terms of income, in terms of wealth, and what kind of handouts or entitlement that they can receive from their respective government. So that is the conventional resource or conventional dimension where poverty is looked at in terms of economic perspective. And of course, there is also the dimension on human capital, which looks at, normally we look at providing access to education to the children so that they can get quality education and therefore obtain better jobs and gain income better than their parents. But what behavioral science or behavioral insight bring to the table is also looking at child brain development and how can it have impact if you are in poverty. And another dimension that is that behavioral insights, a new perspective that behavioral insights bring to the discussion and the policy making of when we talk about poverty and income inequality is about the cognitive dimension. The cognitive dimension, this relates back to human decision making that we talked about in the previous show. Constraints that we have in our decision making is about how do we make choices influenced by certain biases, certain behavioral biases or psychological biases. And another dimension also that behavioral insights bring to the discussion is on character. Whether a person have self-control, because we know that studies on human behavior shows that one of the issues facing people or facing human is our inability from time to time for self-control. Our lack of motivation to do certain things brings a new dimension to the discussion on poverty and how do we go about alleviating people out of poverty. And finally, is another dimension that is also fresh, is about social dimension, where, as we all know, human can be, as individual, we have this tendency for herd mentality, where we tend to follow what other people do, even though others, what other people do, the action or the decision that other people make or the choice that people make in their life may not necessarily be the most optimum decision that they make. So social is also an important component in looking at poverty and income inequality. And finally, the other dimension is also about environmental. When we talk about environmental, it's about where people live, their housing quality. And if you remember in the about multidimensional poverty, it looks at living standard. And this also housing quality is very relevant to living standard of people, the neighborhood that they live in, whether it's safe or not, and what kind of environment, the surrounding environment, whether there's green space, area for people to play and all that. So that I think is a key message here about looking at poverty. Behavioral insights and behavioral science bring to a new perspective, a more comprehensive look at how do we examine, analyze poverty, and by doing so, by having a better, a more comprehensive understanding on poverty and income inequality, hopefully then policymakers and researchers who study these two issues facing society will be able to come up with a better intervention or new type of intervention to address the issue. For many years, scholars have studied decision making of people who live in poverty. As far back as in the 1930s, scholars have looked at whether or not when you are poor, your decision making is not as good if you are not. And poverty is has been associated with diminished behavioral control, and poverty is being said to make the economic decision making more difficult for people. And cognitive functions of people who live in poverty are said to be strained because of the fact that they live in poverty. The question has been raised as to whether poverty leads to issues on cognitive function. And the other part of the question is whether as a result or cognitive function will also have impact on poverty. So the two interrelated question here, whether as a result of poverty then people cannot make a good decision, and the other question is also about because of the fact that they cannot make good decision and therefore they continue to live in poverty. So these interrelations between poverty and cognitive function, or the way people make decision, has been examined by scholars as to whether the interrelations between the two will make people will continue to be in a poverty trap, and the fact that they will be trapped in poverty and not be able to get out of the poverty trap. Did mention earlier about cognitive functions. Well, what is cognitive functions? Really is about our mental process that control our attention, dictate our ability to work with information, and it is required, very important for us to do deliberate activities. So it's a very important function for the functioning of a human being. And you can imagine if, for example, we cannot focus or give attention, we cannot process the information, what implication does it have on our decision-making ability? It is crucial, this cognitive functions is crucial to performing tasks and in decision-making. And there has also been a work or studies been done to look at because conditions or dimensions of poverty and how does it impact on humans' cognition and economic behavior. For example, malnutrition is quite commonly associated with poverty. Children, especially who live in poor household, is vulnerable or subjected to malnutrition. And as a result, there's a question as to whether that leads to a poor decision-making skill as they grow up to become a teenager or adult in later years in their life. Another example is about when talk about impact of poverty on cognition and economic behavior, is about alcohol consumption. In some countries, consumption, especially excessive consumption of alcohol, is also associated with poverty. So that will also have an impact on the decision making of the poor people or poor household. Physical pain, because we know that people who live in poverty normally do have to do the 3D jobs, the dirty and dangerous jobs, and that leads them to physical pain And when you have that physical pain, what influence does it have to your ability to make a judgment or to make decision? Sleep deprivation or having quality sleep has also been looked at in terms of looking at how does it impact decision making of people in poor or low income households. And there are various other conditions related to uh, uh, people living in poor or household of poverty. For example, the environmental factors, having living in a house which is exposed to heat, noise, or air pollution, be it at home or at work, that will also have impact on cognitive and economic behavior. Studies in the UK, for example, have looked at how behavioral insights can help in policy making or policy formulation to address the issue related to people who are in poverty or in the low income household. There are three main categories, for example, in the UK, where they look at what behavioral insights can bring value to the formulation of policy or initiatives to address poverty. One is to do with, for example, minimizing costs. And when I talk about minimizing costs, for example, in obtaining credit facility, loans, what can policymaker do to minimize costs of people who live in poverty to obtain credit facility, a loan that they need for whatever reason during rainy days throughout various phases in their life. Secondly, it's about savings. Under minimizing costs is also about savings, because we know that normally people in poverty have limited or no savings at all. So how do you go about encouraging people to have savings? I will show that with an example later on. And secondly, is about the second category of recommendation made in the UK is about maximizing resources. How do we go about maximizing resources for people who live in poverty, especially looking at about their job? How do we help them in terms of so that they can get steady income? How do you go about helping them to obtain help or assistance from the government? How do you go about doing that, making it easy for them based on clear understanding of the behavior drivers behind the issues facing the people who live in poverty or those who are in poor households? And third category of recommendation that is being used or proposed in the UK is to how do you go about preventing intergenerational poverty, so that the children of poor people or those in low income household would be better off compared to their parents, so that they can get out of the poverty trap. And some of the initiatives that are recommended in the UK, for example, looking at parenting, how do you go about supporting the families in the areas of parenting? In education, particularly post-secondary education, how do you go about getting more children from poor households to go to university or to go to higher education, doing TVET or various other tertiary level education? And some of the examples that initiatives that are being used in the UK are, for example, instead of having to create so that the poor or those living in poverty have better financial management skills, instead of giving them financial awareness education, what is recommended is to develop a rule of thumb for personal financial management, so that for example, if they have to go and obtain a credit facility or to apply for a loan, what should be the first institution or the first product that they should be looking at, which gives them, for example, the lowest interest rate, so that the burden of having to repay the loan is lower compared to if they are taking a loan which with high interest rate. In the UK, one of the initiatives that they look at is what can policymakers or regulators do to, for example, limit the type of products or credit products or loans to the poor people, so that they are not exposed to products that will have a very, for example, very high interest rate. One good example on how to help the people who are in low-income household, who are in poverty, to make better decisions in applying or using credit facility or loan in their life is by sending them a message or envelope containing message that compare the amount of money that they have to pay in interest rate for various type of credit facility or loan. And in this case, for example, is between comparison between payday lending or loan versus credit card, in which it shows that payday lending has a lot higher interest rate and is already given in terms of the actual amount that they have to pay. And with this kind of information given in this context, framed in this way, hopefully the people who receive this message will be able to make decision as to what kind of credit facility or loan that they should make for their own good. And going back to the approach of behavioral insights about problem solving, really understanding the issue at hand. What is the issue that is trying to be addressed? For example, we look at certain country, in Malaysia, for example, the amount of food wastage is very high. And it is reported that the amount of food wastage in the country can feed 12 million people a day. So just imagine, on one hand, you have these people among the population in society who are poor, who don't have sufficient food, who do not have nutritious food for the children as well as the adults. But on the other hand, there's wastage of food. So there must be a creative way or a more innovative way of addressing this imbalance in society. I think there has been several initiatives in this area. For example, working with a supermarket who have excess food that will go to waste, and use that excess food that would otherwise go to waste, and to support the charity, the people who live in certain communities and all that, while the food is still good to consume. And there are other applications too when we talk about using or applying behavioral insights in addressing income inequality and poverty. For example, in how do you go about encouraging children at school to eat healthy food so that they grow healthily and they can perform better at school. So by understanding their behavior, the way they think, there are ways that school administrators can do. There are ways that relevant agency or ministry can do to help, to introduce in terms of initiative or intervention. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the scheme that can be introduced to, for example, to encourage people to save more, to have savings, is by using various type of intervention, using behavioral insights. For example, by sending them a text message, send a reminder so that they save. Secondly, is to have some kind of a coin or a reminder where they can mark on that coin, they can scratch on that coin whenever they make saving into their account. And thirdly is the conventional incentive by the government, where government give financial incentive, matching saving. For example, if it's a $10, if a a person put $10 to save in their account, then the government put a matching amount of $10 or some other amount. So that's a financial incentive. Question is, between the three interventions, this is done through, if remember before we talked about doing it through RCT, randomized control trial, where there'll be a control group and there'll be other groups who will receive different type of intervention, so that comparisons can be made, measurements can be made to measure the effectiveness of each of the intervention. So the question then to the policymakers is, what kind of intervention, which type of intervention is the most effective? And this is where the importance of having an experimental, a culture of experimentation, of testing different type of intervention to cater for diverse group of target group. And from this study or from this intervention that was done for more than 2,000 people who live in low income household, it was found that the most effective intervention is the second intervention, which is the reminder in the form of coin, a coin that the individual will mark whenever he or she put money in their saving account. So this gives a new perspective in terms of what kind of initiative we should do to encourage people to save. Instead of the conventional incentive or conventional intervention, as well as assumption that some policymakers may have assumption that by giving financial incentive, matching amount of money will encourage people to save. That can be one method as well, but from this study, it shows that it's not necessarily the case that by giving financial incentive, people will respond accordingly. So that's why it's important to have this culture of experimentation, testing different type of interventions, and measure them accordingly, what is the most effective for the target group that we are looking at. One of the most common issue that is faced by many countries is to do with retirement savings. And here I will show some evidence from Malaysia where nearly 80% of people who are nearing retirement in year 2015 will not have enough savings to live above the poverty line. So what does it suggest is that, okay, in Malaysia, for example, we have all private sector employees are required by law to contribute to a pension fund. But what is this saying is that the fact that 80% of people nearing retirement don't have enough savings, it shows that they are from low income. This issue is further amplified by the fact that in Malaysia, for example, the life expectancy has improved because of better healthcare, and therefore people have longer years to live after they retire. And one of the solutions from Behavioural Insights is a program called Save More Tomorrow, a program that was implemented in the United States of America, based on the understanding of how people think and how people behave. What this program does is to ask people to commit now to save for the future. Because we know one of the bias among humans is that we have what is called in psychology present bias, which means that we tend to give more weight to things that are happening now compared to the things that will happen in the future. We are more concerned with what's happening today compared to what's going to happen sometime in the future, which we cannot see. So in this program, what it asks is that each of the people who are enrolled in this program to commit now to save for the future, and it is tied to their whenever they receive an increment or a pay raise in the future, their contribution to the fund, to the pension fund, will be increased accordingly. And once an employee or a worker is in the program, they will remain in the program unless they opt out. So because again, this is also related to how we behave, our psychology of human being, where we have this tendency of remaining with status quo. We tend to stick to what is the status quo or what is being set as a default. So in this case, they are making use of that tendency for human to remain in status quo. If once they are enrolled in that program, they will remain in that program unless they opt out of that program. So that will help to increase savings among workers in the United States of America. So with that, I've kind of covered the applications of behavioral insights in addressing poverty and income inequality, which are two goals in the Sustainable Development Goals. To conclude, I'm giving here the overall conclusion about behavioral insights and its application in addressing poverty and inequality. I hopefully from this show has demonstrated that behaviorally informed policies based on sound science from behavioral science are required to improve effectiveness of public policy, meaning that good understanding of human behavior on how human make decision is of importance in formulating and implementing policy. Secondly, as you can see from some of the example interventions, behavioral insights offer cost-effective and innovative solution to public policy or policy that government try to implement in a particular country. It has been shown also that behavioral insights proven to be able to tackle issues related to poverty and income inequality. From our understanding on decision making among the poor people, we know that we get a better understanding on how to address poverty and therefore be able to design relevant interventions accordingly. And from that, I think stakeholders, this is where stakeholders can play their role to incorporate behavioral insight in policy making, knowing the importance of understanding human decision making and therefore human behavior. And finally, also, I think it is important that in implementing behavioral insights, study is recommended. Study is conducted so that experience is gained, and from the experience, expertise among the local practitioners in public policy can also be acquired. And in Malaysia, for example, case studies are being done to test various interventions based on understanding of certain specific issues and behaviors of target group for the given issue. With that, I thank you for your attention. Thank you for joining us in this show. Hopefully, this discussion or presentation on behavioral insights and how it can be applied in addressing sustainable development goals, particularly poverty and income inequality, has been very useful. Until next time, thank you. See you again.